So today I had planned to offer a presentation on illegal coinage, the first of a number of presentations that could potentially come from Spacehawk LLC discussing the subject of illegal coinage. And there were a number of topics to be broached that could potentially be a part of a series. However, as I understand it, that what has happened in the last few days have actually exposed criminal activities that are actionable offenses, including in consideration of national security. And while this is information that needs to get out to the people in a very substantial manner, that what it also entails is a particular perspective that needs to be argued in court. And it needs to be justified in an official forum as being legal argumentation to establish precedent for consideration of various elements of illegal coinage and what the appropriate remedy is, as well as what are appropriate legal standards that can be applied in order to prevent against its exploitation. And so, for this reason, I am doing a reconsideration of the formal presentation I was going to give. Topics included that were to be part of that presentation have already been approached and have already been put into the public realm by me, not only in terms of responses, which would be legal responses or responses that would have been part of arguments I would have presented in court, or that I would have presented as part of perhaps even consideration of potential legislative relief that could have been provided and it could have been implemented as a way to forestall or prevent against exploitation, but also as part of other things that I've done that I've put into a video format and put onto into the public record insofar as I've provided it to the public by my websites and by the YouTube. Now, I'm under no pretense that there's somebody or some groups of people that have misrepresented the actual circulation of the information I put into the public realm, and that there are those that have disabused it and have used it, including in processes of illegal coinage, and including in commission of other crimes. And they're crimes. Please understand. We're not talking about, oh, it was a mishap or it was a misunderstanding. There's no plausible deniability moving forward. And there hasn't been any plausible deniability since I actually went on the record in a video format in on YouTube, because there has been no confirmation or any sort of any effort to actually approach me as a human being. I have dealt with things in a manner that I have, and so instead today I am going to honor somebody that I have not honored publicly and have not acknowledged. It came up last night. I spent at least 2 hours involved in a monologue that was very distinct from anything I've experienced for a very long time, but it's very sincere, and I want to honor parts of that. Now, I'm going to say that I am not currently, I don't remember specifically the names of the individuals that I will be discussing. They had gone on the public record and they put their names into the public realm at the time. So it is not as if there was a matter of confidentiality or protecting witnesses or protecting sources. They were on the public record. They were leaders in their community. They were political leadership. And I understood this and I respected it. And with whatever else that was going on, including what would have been considered by some to be an internal critique in the processes of movement building, there is a necessary element of self criticism, i.e., we are in a struggle together, and so we reflect on the composition of that struggle, including leadership within that struggle. So, a particular analysis of somebody's exhibition of leadership or somebody's demonstration of political priorities, both in how they articulate it, but also in how they live it, is worthy of critique. And that critique is a reflection of us as a self. This is how I understand self criticism. So, this is a healthy thing. And it's actually something that I have been completely denied in the last 5 years. Self criticism is not the same as slander. And critique of political movement is not the same as defamation intended to degrade somebody or devalue them for whatever reasons that others might justify that being considered to be a specifically useful strategy or applicable in whatever context they're in. At the time I met these people, I'm going to tell the story the best I remember it. I was in Honduras in 2015, and I had gotten word from people I had used to associate with that were originally from Chicago that they were going to have a human rights delegation observation to Honduras. Now, I was already there on a completely different matter. I'd gone to teach at a private school, teach minors at a private school. When I heard about this, when I got the information about this online through Facebook, there was a notice on Facebook and I saw it. I contacted them and asked if I could meet with them while they were in town, and then they discussed the matters related to the delegation. And I told them that I wanted to participate, but that I had to do some considerations. And I told the people I was working with at the school. I told the headmistress, I told the principal, told the vice principal, and I told the other teachers that prior to my arrival in Honduras at that time, part of what I told them when I applied was that I'd been there earlier, several years before, as part of a human rights delegation where I visited different communities, and that that group of people was going to be coming to Honduras for a human rights delegation, and I wanted to participate, but it would mean I would have to take a couple of days off from some of the classes. And the understanding was that I was requesting to have several days of the school week off so that I could participate during the full time frame. And it was agreed. There was no dissension. Nobody told me that there was anything amiss about this. I gave them plenty of notice. I wasn't expecting them to provide me with anything. I was going to fund and deal with it in the manner I did. It would mean, of course, though, that I would not be in school for a few days and be teaching. Somebody would have to deal with that while I would be participating in the delegation. So I did, and I ended up joining them a little bit later because of internal problems I won't discuss now. But what I want to focus on is there was a group that I met with in the city. We'd first gone to Tegucigalpa, and then after going to Tegucigalpa, we'd gone to Comayagüela, which is right, if I recall correctly, north of Tegucigalpa. And while there, we met with a group of mostly women who supported movements for justice for people who had been disappeared. This is something I had learned about and heard about, but it was different to actually meet with these women in person and to talk with them about the topic they were discussing and about their lives and what they were mentioning, what was going on. They were discussing how numbers of people, political activists, specifically that had a particular kind of political leadership acumen and that were attempting to build political movement, including people that were involved in the university system, some of whom were professors, including professors that had families that were approaching university age, some of whom were students within this university movement, and then other people that were trying to organize from that milieu had been disappeared. And the understanding was is that what happens is that a person you know may be arrested and you just don't ever hear anything back. And or they might just not show up at a meeting and you just don't hear anything about it. And you go, you try to ask the government, there's a missing person. They just don't ever give you any response. You don't hear about it for years. And you also don't get any closure. The body's never found. You never see the body, so you never get to confirm that they were murdered. They died in some other manner. It was an accident. They're never found. They're dead. Or you'd have no confirmation that's what happened. And in the course of this meeting, one of the things that was done is we were taken on a tour. They had taken us on a tour of areas in the vicinity that were connected to what they were trying to do in terms of mounting or get some justice for the propensity and the preponderance of people that had been disappeared. My understanding is that this was something that went all the way back to the early 80s. There was a period of time, specifically during the 80s, where a very large number of people were disappeared that were from particular political legacies in Honduras specifically. And then after a while, it kind of died off for a while, and then it resumed. And there was a period later where there was another wave of people who were disappeared. And in the course of meeting with them, there was a tour that was engaged, and there were several areas that we were taken to on the tour that had a very, very profound impact on me. In one of the areas we went to, there was a house, and the house had a separate facility right off the side of the house, and we were told that there had been a professor who had been in a particular position of leadership He might even have been in a position of government or on his way to running for government. And what had happened is as they understood it, people that worked with the Honduran military at the time had kidnapped his children. Now, these were older children, they were adult children. At least one or two of them were actually in the university at the time. They had kidnapped his children, I believe there were three, and they held them at that house for a period of time and they tortured them. And it was a ceremonial form of torture. Yet there were different parts of the house where they were locked, they were confined in a specific and distinct manner from the other two. And then there was a separate room, and they were taken into that separate room whenever the time frame was determined, or whenever it was determined it was time for them to be tortured. And they were tortured. They did not describe, nobody described to me what the specific techniques were that they used. But the understanding was that there was some sort of schedule almost. There was some sort of schedule and there was some sort of process. And what really struck me at the time is looking at the layout of the actual house and seeing where they were kept. And all these years later, understanding the subtleties and the possibilities that one who's so inclined could conceive of if they were to use some ritual torture, such as was being described that they had been subjected to. It was part of a long term paradigm. As a matter of fact, I believe I'm seeing it now. I'm seeing aspects of what was intentioned and what was constructed in these ceremonies of torture of these people that were meant to have a long term impact on the unconscious of people they were connected to, but also an unfolding of a paradigm whereby people become acculturated to a sort of macabre social conditioning with the intention that over time, people's normalization may then allow for a permissibility of a form of sardonicism that can itself be cultivated into sadism. And that sadism being a replacement for actual demonstrable leadership. And this is intentionally orchestrated, I believe. And it's part of a multi-generational, long-term paradigm. And I absolutely believe that what they were discussing was absolutely relevant for the contemporary time frame we're in now, especially in the manners in which a refusal to acknowledge, ground, and establish literal, third-dimensionally verifiable standards and processes to be the reference points for a specific kind of engagement are supplanted by a form of performance that has been abstracted, including insofar as it is allowed to be depicted as art, with a concept that somehow art is divorced from a kind of political agency that then makes it responsible for the implications of its application. And this goes back to things that when I was obtaining my political consciousness around the time I tried to go to college but was also working. My social milieu was mostly in college, but I worked. And in the course of this, we discussed political matters. And one of the things that I remember was early critiques that I read from what I understood came specifically from the work of Leon Trotsky, discussing art and discussing the role of art in the political paradigm of a movement, and an understanding that the artist ultimately is responsible for what he or she puts into the political realm. And I've struggled with this. I've struggled with this my whole life because I've also read a comparable critique by Michael Harrington. Michael Harrington discusses in his works this understanding of what it was for him. He wanted to be a poet, but for whatever reason, poetry did not suit him as well as journalism. And so his relationship with the concept of the novel, for instance, and the concept of a political novel, he has a very, very concerted and very sophisticated, I believe, analysis. But over time, as you are influenced by these kinds of concepts and these manners in which these concepts become live in your life, they become living in your life, that there's a lot of compatibility in these perspectives. This understanding that even from an artistic perspective, even from the perspective of the abstract, even from the perspective of the sardonic, or maybe even parody, that there's a certain kind of responsibility one has. And when you're in a particular kind of way, part of the responsibility may be, well, you're literally responsible for what happens. You said something, you're responsible. You created it. And this concept that comes from another way of being, this understanding that the word is bond, or we create with what we say. Speak no evil, because if you speak of the evil, then you have created it, you've imbued it with some sort of power, and that's allowed to promulgate. Well, that is a particular manner of understanding, but the other concept is also this understanding of truth and the responsibility for saying, I am attempting to obtain an audience for my wrestling with or grappling with or embracing of a perspective, an aesthetic, a juxtaposition, a challenge, a paradigm, a manner of trying to take things in an abstract manner and express something that may literally be dangerous to say, even going into the realm of the grotesque or going into the realm of the insulting, the profane. These concepts of what does it mean to be responsible with that? So you are literally responsible for the profanity or the profanation? Or are you literally responsible for following through on the intent you had when you asked for the audience? And so this is something that I think is part of what they were talking about, especially when they were discussing this concept of art in a context of political movement, is this understanding of it's not necessarily that the literal manifestation or instantiation of the art or the work of art is your responsibility and all of its derivatives and everything that happens. It's your responsibility. You are responsible for what somebody else does with it. You are responsible for the intent you have in seeking the audience to participate in the art, because it's kind of a sort of corollary to this concept of the quantum observer. By viewing, by participating, and by absorbing, you are also a part of it. So when an artist requests your audience and you engage it and you consider it and you critique it, and you are responding to what their request was in so far as they presented it. And so the question becomes, well, does the artist have authenticity with this? Does the artist follow through? Or is it just propaganda? Is it just meant to accomplish a particular kind of coercive social or political implementation without actually participating in the movement building? And this is how I understand it now. And the reason I bring this up is because we have a very intense situation going on. When I was in Honduras and they were describing these processes during this tour, and they were showing us the terrain and the area, they were doing something then. They were discussing how something was being done then that's happening right now, where you're taking crime scenes and there's a bureaucratic malaise. It just doesn't have time to get back to it, or we don't have enough evidence, or they just refuse to talk to you. And then the timeline passes, and then somebody defaults, and then the next thing you know, well, it's no longer a crime scene. If you don't talk about it as a crime scene, that's not what it is. You need to move on. Let go of the past. You need to move on. That was the past. There's things that are happening. We need progress. We need evolution. You're holding on to the past. And as long as you hold on to the past, well, you can't grow. We need you to let go. Look, it's transforming. That's not what it is. Well, you could have demolished the house after you took in an inventory for evidence and or explained who it was that owned the property and who was coming into contact with the property around the time frames of concern, and that what ended up happening later to see if there was any demonstration that the actual land and other things that occurred there were connected to any sort of illicit financial processes that ended up proliferating other kinds of crime that are connected to other things we've asked you to investigate, and then follow through maybe 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 25 years later. They're still gone. 25 years later, they're still missing. And they haven't been confirmed as dead. And they also haven't demolished the house and allowed for a ceremony to maybe cleanse the space, maybe honor the earth as a way to at least make peace with the earth. But now, well, you need to let go. Besides, we decided we're going to do something else with it. What are you going to do? And this is what's happening now. Shh, don't talk about it. Don't talk about it. So then it brings up the question of the actual political utility of disappearance. What are the implications of disappearing people? Now, I did not really get to speak with these women and this organization too much. I did not get to have a very comprehensive follow-through. But I believe that the phenomena of political disappearance is not only more prevalent than is acknowledged, but I believe it serves a specific kind of political utility, including for those that would claim to be critics, if not in a direct opposition, including potential armed opposition, to the state actors that are identified as being the culprits of particular periods of forced disappearance. There was a time frame where one of the things the woman that was one of the leaders in the organization was discussing with us when we were talking, she was saying, well, people don't really want me. The people on the left, specifically, don't really want me in leadership. And it's a challenge. And I experienced this myself when trying to talk to other people about my experiences speaking with her in that organization. There was a particular kind of condescension. There was almost an understanding that she personally did not fit in. She wasn't qualified as a leader in the same way other people were. I didn't quite understand this. But then I started living part of what I believe she was discussing without being able to follow through. I believe that we live in a world right now where so-called political activity that is acknowledged is literally fueled by people intentionally disappeared from within that community. They know where they are. They know where they are, and they're willing to sacrifice them because not only would they have a political objective to accomplish that would be in opposition to the ones they were trying to promote, including ones they might have been able to promote more successfully, or they to have been able to be successful. But somebody needs to get paid. And maybe they believe they need a particular kind of currency. This gets into what the original intent of today was, discussions of illegal coinage and the concept of what defines money and how is it valued and what is a currency and how do you match a currency versus artificially devaluing a currency. Taking something that's at one level that has one kind of content, one kind of possibility that if appropriately paired or appropriately directed can provide for a certain kind of productivity and abundance. But if it's intentionally mischaracterized, then it can be used as a misrepresentation of the accumulation of surplus value that somebody else can use as part of their capital accumulation that they can then use to justify their worth more than they actually are. It's okay sometimes to have certain enemies, especially if you can control them by being able to manipulate their ego based upon some secret shame they have. And if you can manipulate their ego based upon some secret shame they have, you might be able to also get them to follow the path of cultivating that sardonic tendency that is very easy to refine into a form of sadism that allows the justification for further perpetuation of suffering under specific auspices, including those That can take a spiritual turn, discuss it as a form of purification, i.e., what I understand is part of the ethos of the Ku Klux Klan, or there is a specific social or political imperative that is the most utilitarian in order to accomplish a national goal and or to assure a consistency in a representation of the national character comparable to communist brainwashing. But the understanding is that there's a justification for inflicting suffering on somebody outside even of a specific standard or process or public accountability, a public presentation that then one can be held accountable to long term. You've identified this person as a criminal. You have said that this person has committed crimes and that these crimes have had social cost. And in the course of the society being assessed these costs, that there is some restitution that is due. And the criminal themselves needs to be a part of that restitution. What needs to be restituted? How is that restitution to be accomplished? Now we get to the political and economic utility of forced disappearance. I believe the Ayotzinapa 43 are still alive. I believe that somewhere in either Mexico or perhaps even in the border region on the Texas side of the border, I believe they're still alive. I believe that they have been used in a paradigm comparable to what happens at Guantanamo Bay and comparable to what has been happening in other parts of the world, including what's accused of being ongoing in China, and including in what is, I believe, re-establishing itself in parts of the former Soviet Union. And that ultimately, in addition to it providing a form of illicit currency, i.e. a form of cryptocurrency, including for people that have some don't ask, don't tell arrangement about being able to access it, that there's also the impact of what it does to the unconscious of the people with whom they're associated. The terror. And without the confirmation of their actual dead bodies, there's always the doubt, and especially if they are alive and they're being tortured. Or, as I suspect, they're alive and they're being force drugged. I believe they may be being tortured with drugs, that they were force drugged and force drugged in a manner to acquire a physical addiction. And then periodically they're given drugs, and then periodically they're denied drugs. So they go through the actual physical symptoms of some sort of withdrawal in addition to whatever else is going on. I believe that there's some manner in which their actual physical pain threshold is volleyed between periods of when they are on drugs and being tortured and when they're not on drugs and being tortured. And it is a way to create an unconscious disruption of the people. And part of the aim and intent is to cultivate addiction in others. And when you're unconsciously associated with or you're connected to a community that has cravings that you don't have, I don't crave that somebody else does. And so all of a sudden you find yourself desiring to eat things, especially if you don't do other things. It's a test of the individual will, but it's also a test of how to destroy collective will. I believe they're still alive. And I believe that there are plenty of people who know. It's almost as if they buy timeshares on them. Comparable to what I believe they do at Gitmo. I believe there are actually people, and they're lawyers, diabolical enough to buy timeshares on human harvesting factories that produce a particular kind of energy as well as a particular currency that they attempt to use to accomplish their political goals. Now, this is a very ornate situation. But let me tell you something. My review of DoD contracts in the last 3 years absolutely substantiates that allegation. My recent review of activities connected to FEMA absolutely substantiates that allegation. My experiences during Hurricane Harvey, my experiences since I've been in Dallas, absolutely substantiate that allegation. I don't have any proof. That's not what's happening. And the concern I have is that there are plenty who know and are trying to compete for market share. They can claim they're doing any other thing in the world, but ultimately that's what they're doing. And you don't want a woman that refuses to let go of the past. And you certainly don't want a group of women and men that refuse to let go of that past. You don't want that. It's inconvenient. You know, unfortunately, when it comes to DoD contracting, convenience actually has a form of currency. Did you know that? It's really all there is to say right now today.